Hello, welcome to Crafty Olga. I'm Olga. So for today's project, I'm going to be showing you how I made one part of a kind of cosplay or like bound that I'm working on. Obviously, you already know what it is because you've seen the title of this video, so it's not that suspenseful. So basically, I've, like so many other people, have been playing a lot of Hogwarts Legacy. Still haven't finished my journey on there. A lot of the clothes of the characters are just making my imagination go wild. The game is set in the 1890s. The thing is, I'm not that well versed in 1890s fashion. My era of interest is the 40s, 50s. I'm not really interested in recreating cosplays that I'm not gonna get a wear out of. I don't go to cons. I don't really go to places that I could get wear out of a cosplay. So my sort of bounds and cosplays have to be very wearable and things that I actually would wear in my everyday life. Still kind of nerdy and inspired from the things that I enjoy and that bring me joy. That is a very long-winded explanation and way to say that I am making a Hogwarts Legacy inspired uniform of Hogwarts, obviously for a Hufflepuff, 1940s, 1950s inspired, probably like an early 50s. The first thing that we're going to be working on today is the shirt. Actually, we're not going to be working on it today. You're going to be watching it today, and I've already made this like 3 weeks ago. This is Vogue 8772. This is their easy options range. You've got a lot of options, as you can see here. There's 6 views. There's like different options, different length. I got this for free from Minerva.com. I create content for them. I'm sure you can find some different variations or something that is more suited to your style out there. There's lots of free things that you can use. So this is the leftovers I have. Okay, so it has like a white base, but then it has all these like yellow, maybe like a mustard yellow little, I don't know what they're not dots, they're like sprinkles. And it's like an all over pattern that makes this, when you pull it a bit further away, it just looks like a sort of yellowish fabric. And then when you see it up close, it has all these little like sprinkle, like teeny tiny crinkle fries. I found this at a market I went to with my mother-in-law, and it's way cheaper than it is in stores. I think I got 2 meters of this. I have like a little bit left over, but not that much. So I'm gonna show you how I made that.
Okay, so first things first, we would normally be cutting the pattern, so all the paper pieces, but I've already done that because I'd already made this before. So essentially, I have washed and pressed my fabric. I think you should definitely do that. I know it's something that we always get lazy with, but it definitely helps and yields better results for cutting and stuff. So I'm just trying to figure out placements, try to use as little fabric as possible while still getting all my pieces in there and, having correct grain lines and all of these things. And then I will often consult the instructions and the patterns that have the layouts for cutting. I find those really helpful in specific situations just for suggestions and stuff. So yeah, that's what I'm doing here. I also wanted to tell you that I decided to make view D. I didn't actually say that in my long intro. So we're making view D, which actually has the long sleeves and the collar. So it's like a regular button up. And I'm making that with the detachable collar. Well, I'm making the collar detachable from view B. So I'm making the big bow detachable. Originally in the pattern for view B, I found that the bow came quite far down, so I decided to make that a little bit shorter, and I found that was the perfect size the way I folded it. I honestly just folded it that way because I didn't want to cut any more fabric than I had to. What I'm doing here actually is I'm trying to figure out the placement for the bow, and originally you're supposed to cut it on the bias, but I ended up just cutting it on the straight grain, and I didn't find it made a difference because obviously you're supposed to cut it on the bias for view B because it's the collar. You're gonna have to sew that to the neckline, and it's a rounded seam, so the bias being cut on the bias really helps with that. But the fact that it was just going to be a decorative part of the shirt, I decided not to cut it on the bias. I will fold my fabric right sides together after I wash it and press it, and then I will also then roll it up kind of like they do in stores, fabric stores. I find that it just makes it easier for storing and for cutting personally at home. And it also means that when I'm actually pinning things and I need to pin several pieces and I don't really know if everything's going to fit before I actually start cutting, I will pin and then fold the fabric and it stays perfectly well pinned down. So once you have everything pinned correctly the way you want it and you're happy with it, go ahead and cut that out. I'm using my handy dandy Millward scissors. These are the rose gold. I think they only come in a like gift pack. They're quite old now. I mean, I say quite old. I think maybe 3 or 4 years old, but I use them every day, so they're starting to look their age actually. But I highly recommend. They're very good quality and they're not that expensive. So yeah, they're pretty good value for money for sure. I also went ahead and cut out some interfacing. I think the one I'm using here is Vilene Vliezline F220. That's kind of my favorite sort of medium lightweight interfacing. I'm not sure if that's the one I'm using, or if I'm using one that is even lighter. I might be using the lighter weight, but either way, you want a lightweight interfacing. I like this one. F220 is pretty good, and I can't remember the other one, but they have like a super lightweight interfacing that's also really good. Yeah, so you can also go ahead and apply the interfacing to the fabric straight away. That's what I like to do anyways. So I know some people will mark their fabric and then interface, but I feel like then all of your markings disappear, so I don't really see the point of doing it that way. But obviously do it however you feel is the best way you've got for yourself. I don't think there's a right or wrong way of doing things in sewing. I think there's the way you do it and different circumstances and different, materials, different people, different things. So it depends what you're using, what you're doing. They recommend to use your iron on low to medium for 8 seconds, but honestly, I just steam because I am very impatient and I've been doing this method for probably like 5 years and I haven't had any problems. So I mean, do whatever you think is best, but I haven't had any problems with this method, so I would recommend. And for fabric marking, we're doing the notches. I use my fabric scissors for that. And then I do a heat erasable pen for the markings. If there's anything that I really need to stay on there, like, buttonholes, but there's certain markings that you need throughout the whole process and you're going to need to go back to, and you're going to press that area before you get to the markings, and those I will stitch mark. Otherwise, I'm going to go heat erasable pen. Yeah, depending on how patient I am or how much time I want to spend on a project, I will stitch mark more or less. So if I know that it's something that I'm going to take my time making, like maybe it's going to be a month long project or whatever, something I'm going to work on the weekends, then I might stitch mark because I won't remember where the markings are. But if I'm doing something quite quickly, and I think I made this shirt in like an afternoon, so if I'm doing it that way, then I just mark it quite quickly and get on with it, so I don't spend that much time on it. Okay, so time for sewing finally. First, I do all the darts. I always sew all of my darts in one go. I don't know, a habit I have from when I started sewing. I didn't like doing darts and it just kind of stuck with me. So basically I pin my darts when they're still laying flat, so you can see I'm sticking my pins through from one line of the dart to the other, and then what I do is I will then kind of squish the fabric together so that the lines meet, and then I pin properly, so pin it down, and that's what I do. I'll just rinse and repeat for all of the darts, which in this particular shirt I think are a few. So we have 2 darts in the back and then 2 darts in each side, into each front panel. So 4 frontal darts in total, which is quite a lot of darts actually, now that I think about it. Okay, so to actually sew the darts, what I do is I start with the white part. Obviously, some of these are both are double-ended darts, so that won't work here, but I will explain that in a bit. So first, for regular darts, what I do is I start with the white part, the white open area, backstitch there, and then I sew through all the end to the end of the dart to the tip, and then I don't backstitch, and I leave the threads a little bit long. And then for double-ended darts, what I do is I start in one end and don't backstitch, leave the threads long, and basically sew through the same way. Again, don't backstitch and leave the thread tails long. Then I use those thread tails to tie them maybe 3 or 4 times depending, and I'll cut them down to maybe like a couple of centimeters or like an inch, and I'll just leave them like that, and they don't bother me at all when I'm wearing the shirt or the outfits. And then I press the darts like normal. So yeah, I'm just pressing them using my tailor's ham, making sure that they're nice, sometimes I will look at the instructions and see where they're telling me to press the darts towards, but oftentimes I honestly just wing it. I kind of let the dart tell me where it wants to go, unless I have a very specific idea of what I'm doing, like where I want the dart to go, I mean. And we're gonna use that hot iron we already have and turn the front opening edge to the inside along those outer fold lines and press that in place. Essentially, you turn it over once, press, and then turn it over again and press again. That's it. It's very simple. And now we can actually just jump right into stitching the shoulder seams and the side seams. I think I did it all in one go. Yeah, so I just pin that in place and match the notches, match the darts, and any other kind of markings that there might be. And normally I honestly just sew it all in one go, and then I finish those seams with my serger and press them in place. Always press your seams, always. Remember when I told you earlier that I did this all in one afternoon? Well, I guess I lied, and the footage is telling you the truth. Also, I hurt my finger. Oh my god, I remember what happened. So I went to out for a few drinks with my partner, and I went to the bathroom, washed my hands, and when I went to the little towel disposal thing, the paper towel things, to dry my hands, I pulled on it so hard that it just broke my nail off, and yeah, it was like raw. There was blood coming out of it. Was gross. So it really hurt, and it was kind of hard to sew, but I still did it, doing it for you guys and for myself, really, because I really wanted to finish this. Anyway, so now I'm putting together the collar. I basically just sew it together, trim the corners. Now I'm gonna do the old flipperoo, flip it to the outside and get nice crisp corners with my chopstick and press that in place. Now that I'm watching this footage, I completely forgot that my nail had done that. It's totally healed now, and I'm just remembering how uncomfortable it was. Like, my finger was throbbing. Good times. Okay, so in telling you that riveting tail, I didn't actually explain what I'm doing. Basically, I was stitching the collar sections together, and I left out the edge that has the double notches. I left that unsewn, and then I trimmed it a little around, like I said, clipped the corners and turned it, pressed it, and supposedly you have to baste the raw edges together, but I don't think I did that. Then you want to turn in the seam allowance on the single notched edge of the uninterfaced collar band. That's what I'm doing here. So there's going to be one that isn't interfaced, and then you're going to turn up the side that has the single notches. Yeah, so press that in, and then you trim that pressed edge to a 3/8 of an inch or 1 centimeter seam allowance. And then you pin the uninterfaced side of the collar to the interfaced collar band between the small circles. That's what I'm doing here. And because I was injured at this point, I just stitched that down really quickly because I was struggling with pins, and the next part that we're going to do is a little fiddly. And then you pin the uninterfaced collar band over the collar and baste that in place, basically making a collar sandwich. And then you stitch that down, leaving the neck edge open, obviously, for obvious reasons. And then you trim. Again, turn that out, press it in place. I actually was supposed to sew this straight away onto the neck edge of the shirt, but at this point I wasn't sure if my detachable collar plan was going to work, or like how it was going to work. I wasn't sure if the bow was gonna need to be like attached physically to the collar, if I just tying it would be fine. So I started working on the bow to figure that out. First, you basically sew down a center back seam, trim, fold that in half, sew it around. It's pretty easy to put together. And then it's kind of, you're just sewing a tube and then you turn it out, press it in place. I believe that the pattern tells you to either close that by hand or just stitch down one side. Honestly, I top stitched all around the bow. For one, you can't really tell that much top stitching in a busy pattern like this on cotton poplin. And for two, I thought it would match really nicely with the collar that was top stitched as well. And I knew that the cuffs were going to be top stitched too, so I thought it would really bring the whole thing together. And now to actually finish the seams. So I'm just remembering this from watching the footage, but I sewed the shirt together, or the panels, the front and back, and then I just left the office. And then I came back the next day and I was like, oh right, I hadn't even finished to press that seam. So that's what I did after I started the bow and the collar. I don't know. This was clearly I was injured and not doing great. Anyway, now that I have all that pressed and finished and great, I can actually attach the collar to the shirt. First, I'm gonna stay stitch that. It's basically a technique where you sew a straight stitch around a curved edge, normally neck, sometimes waistline, and basically you're doing this just to make that edge stronger, because things that are cut on the bias tend to stretch and curve and behave a little weird. So if you're stay stitching it, it just means that it's gonna do that less. And then I'm just gonna pin the collar in place, match all those notches, do all that good stuff. Obviously I'm pinning the part that isn't pressed. I'm pinning that to the shirt, and then the pressed edge is going to fold over the seam that we've just sewn. So when you're actually pressing, you want to press that seam into the neck band, into the collar. And if you need, you might have to trim the corners a little bit with your scissors just to make it fall nice and flat and to be all very neat and very crisp. And then normally I would slip stitch that by hand, but my hand was injured and I couldn't actually push my needle through that easily, and it was going to take forever, so I just sewed it down with a normal stitch. I don't really like doing this because I feel like it's less accurate and not as good, but yeah, then I went ahead and top stitched everything around too. Okay, so now it's time for sleeves. Normally the pattern tells you to ease stitch, but I didn't do this here because I've done this before and I knew I was going to pull all the ease and make it into a tuck at the shoulder. So I forgot that. But then I also went ahead and reinforced the lower edge of the sleeve along the stitching line that I marked earlier, because we're going to be cutting across that, or between those stitches, and you're just reinforcing that seam a little bit. So that's what we're doing here. So basically you sew a triangular shape and then you cut through it. Next, we're going to turn in the little continuous lap. So we're gonna turn in 6 millimeters or 1/4 of an inch of seam allowance on one of the long edges, doesn't matter which, and press that in place. And then we're going to pin the right side of the continuous lap to the wrong side of the sleeve. and we're gonna put the other 6mm seam line along the stitching. You're just adding a little binding to your sleeve so that it doesn't fray and all of these things, and it's also like a decorative thing. Be quite careful, generous with your pins. You're gonna basically use that slash or that cut we put into the sleeve to pull it into like a straight line so that you can pin the continuous lap, and you might have to kind of finagle the fabric a little bit while you're sewing, but that's part of the job. Next, we're going to press the seam of the little sleeve slash thing toward the continuous lap that we just stitched there, and then also turn the pressed edge of the continuous lap to the outside over the seam. So this is what we've already pressed before, and we're going to stitch that in place and press that again. Then on the inside of the sleeve, we're going to bring those folded edges of the continuous lap together and stitch across the upper end diagonally. Then to make the crease, or not the crease, the pleat, the instructions are a little bit confusing. They're like crease this and do that. I basically just bring the lines together that I still have marked on my fabric. And yeah, I just bring those lines together and pin that down, and then I baste that across the bottom so that the pleat will stay in place temporarily, and then I press that in place, and I haven't had any problems with that so far. Next, we're gonna stitch the sleeve seam, the underarm the underarm seam, and yeah, I'm just bringing the notches together and pinning that in place, and stitch, finish, press, all the good stuff, all the usual things. Then to prep our cuff, we're going to turn in the seam allowance on the long unnotched edge of the cuff pieces and press that down. Then you can also trim the seam allowance down to 3/8 of an inch or a centimeter. Then you can pin the cuff to the sleeve. We're going to place the squares at the underarm seam and the large circle at the opening edges. There's going to be a little bit of extra fabric from the cuffs, and you want that. You want that little bit of extra. And then yeah, we can stitch that down, trim, press, all the usual things, exactly like we did with a collar. Then we're gonna do with right sides together, we're gonna fold the cuff along the fold line and stitch the ends, sort of like the sides. And this is where you can tell that that extra fabric we had earlier is a good thing. We'll also need to trim that down, and I also like to trim the little corners just for good measure. Then we're gonna turn that right side out, press that in place, and you can either slip stitch that in place by hand or, top stitch it in the sewing machine if you want. Use pins and be careful with that because it's quite hard to get the stitches to lay nicely on both sides. That's something that takes a lot of practice. So yeah, and then you can also go ahead and top stitch all around the cuff. So yeah, then it's finally time to set the sleeves into the armholes. So obviously with right sides together, we're just going to pin that into the right place. You want to match the double notches and the single notches. Double notches normally go towards the back, just a little tip. Yeah, and supposedly you are going to adjust the ease, but I find that an annoying process that I don't like doing, and I just normally pull all of the ease onto the shoulder and do either like a really tight gather, or I'll do like a little tuck or a few tucks, whatever I'm into on the day. And here I think I did like a teeny tiny box pleat basically. For finishings, we're going to turn the lower edge of the front self facings to the outside along that fold line, and we're going to stitch 1.5 centimeters from the lower edge and trim a little like square kind of shape. Then you're going to turn that into the inside and make a 1.5 centimeter lower narrow hem at the lower edge, continuing across the self facings when you're stitching. And to make a narrow hem, basically what I do is I will fold over my fabric the 1.5 centimeters, then press that, and then I will press the raw edge of the fabric into, like, kind of tuck it in so that it's like a double folded, and then I'll just stitch over that on the machine. You can use pins if you want to. I find that using the iron is easy enough. Sometimes if you have a more fiddly fabric, you need to do the iron and the pins, but I just find that just ironing with something like a cotton is pretty easy. Then we're going to use our handy dandy button guide, or guide for buttons and buttonholes, to guide where we're going to place our buttons and buttonholes. Basically, first you put it on the right front, and you transfer the markings, make the buttonholes, and then use the buttonholes to mark your buttons placement. So first I picked out my buttons. I have a huge collection of vintage buttons, so I was just going through kind of what I wanted to use, if I had enough of the ones that I wanted, and I actually ended up going with like the plainest white buttons that I had because I thought that would look the best. So if you're using the kind of pattern issued sizing of buttons, which I think they recommend 1/2 inch buttons, which is 13 millimeters. So if you're using those, then you're going to use the marking for the buttonholes. But if you're using different sized buttons, then obviously you will need to find out how big your buttons are and make the buttonholes the size of those buttons and not the size that they give you. Luckily, the buttons I ended up using were that size, so it all worked out in the end. So yeah, I'm just using my machine to make my buttonholes. It's pretty easy to do that. So I also used my sewing machine to attach the buttons, which is also very easy to do. So yeah, with all those finishing touches, our shirt was complete, and I can actually show it to you.
There you go. That was how I made this really cute blouse. I hope you enjoyed this process. So I hope that this has helped you or given you some inspiration. Have you tried this pattern? Did you like the fabric choice that I used? Let me know in the comments what you thought about this and all of the answers to all of the questions that I made, like it was an interrogation. I hope you enjoyed this video. Thank you so much for watching. Please subscribe if you have not done that already, and give this video a like so that other people can see it too. I'll see you in the next video. Bye.